Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to an age of velvet curtains, flickering candlelight, and very important men doing absolutely nothing. So go ahead, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe even sink under the covers yourself. Because tonight's story is about kings who made ruling from bed into something of an art form. Some stayed there out of illness, others out of sheer preference. Kingdoms rose and fell, treaties collapsed, and dynasties tangled themselves into knots, all while their sovereigns remained horizontal. It's a story about fragile bloodlines, elaborate egos, and the strangely delicate bodies of Europe's so-called chosen rulers. And naturally, when inbreeding meets untreated medical conditions, meets medieval healthcare, the result is rarely inspiring. But we'll get there gently. Let's start somewhere warm. Versailles, Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, preferred to begin each day very slowly. And by slowly, I mean his famous lever, the royal rising ritual, took on average about 4 hours. Now, in fairness, Louis wasn't exactly lazy. He simply enjoyed being observed. Imagine this. It's early morning. The king is still in bed, draped in embroidered silk, while an entire line of courtiers snakes down the hall, waiting for the honor of watching him put on socks. The first wave, princes, dukes, men of ancient houses, are allowed inside to witness the king sitting up. This was considered deeply important. Then came another wave to watch him wash his face, a third to see his wig adjusted, and finally, a final round of audience members got to stand there reverently while the king yawned. Louis was convinced that power came not from working harder than everyone else, but from making everyone else wait. And naturally, his courtiers learned to applaud his efficiency, even when it took nearly half a morning just to achieve verticality. But Louis XIV at least got up. Others never quite managed it. Let's drift down to Spain for a moment, to the reign of Philip V, a man so firmly attached to his bed that some historians argue he barely ruled at all. Philip became king in 1700 at just 17 years old, a fragile Bourbon import sent south after the Habsburg dynasty sputtered out. And from the start, he showed signs of, well, exhaustion. Philip often refused to dress, eat, or speak to anyone for days at a time. Entire councils of ministers were forced to assemble around his bed, whispering politely while the monarch stared at the ceiling. At one point, he stopped changing clothes altogether, insisting that disrobing might somehow damage his health. He reportedly slept fully dressed, wig and all, in stiff ceremonial stockings. Now, this wasn't entirely laziness. Philip suffered from what modern historians suspect was clinical depression, though his contemporaries simply called it melancholia. But Spanish courtiers had little patience for that sort of thing. A king, after all, was meant to embody strength and stability. And here was Philip, declining to eat breakfast without consulting his confessor and bursting into tears when pressed to sign documents. At one particularly low point, Philip spent 7 continuous years almost entirely in bed, refusing to see ambassadors, review armies, or even attend his own son's weddings. Imagine an entire country waiting outside your bedroom door, and deciding the most powerful solution is simply to leave you alone. You might expect this to have caused chaos in Spain, and of course it did. But in royal courts, there's always a workaround. Philip's second wife, Elizabeth Farnese, quickly realized that her husband's incapacity was an opportunity. While Philip languished beneath the covers, Elizabeth quietly maneuvered herself into power. She decided foreign alliances, appointed ministers, and effectively ran the Spanish Empire, all without ever technically holding the throne. But the court was delicate. Appearances had to be preserved. So official decrees were still carried into Philip's bedroom, ceremonially placed in his hands, and then retrieved by ministers who pretended not to notice when his signature slanted wildly across the page. Spain had a king. He was simply horizontal. Philip wasn't unique. Across Europe, royal beds became strange little command centers. Take Frederick William II of Prussia, who ruled from 1786 to 1797. He wasn't bedridden exactly, but he refused to conduct state business upright if he could avoid it. Ambassadors were summoned into his private chambers, where they'd find the king stretched out on a velvet chaise, one hand draped languidly over a goblet of wine, discussing military strategy while barefoot. Frederick's ministers hated it, but he saw no reason to strain himself when others could stand instead. He also had a habit of falling asleep during audiences, sometimes mid-sentence. There are entire diplomatic records where ambassadors describe speaking to him for 20. Philip wasn't unique. Across Europe, royal beds became strange little command centers. Take Frederick William II of Prussia, who ruled from 1786 to 1797. He wasn't bedridden exactly, but he refused to conduct state business upright if he could avoid it. Ambassadors were summoned into his private chambers, where they'd find the king stretched out on a velvet chaise, one hand draped languidly over a goblet of wine, discussing military strategy while barefoot. Frederick's ministers hated it, but he saw no reason to strain himself when others could stand instead. He also had a habit of falling asleep during audiences, sometimes mid-sentence. There are entire diplomatic records where ambassadors describe speaking to him for 20 minutes before realizing he was unconscious. Yet, in court reports, these meetings were still carefully logged as productive. But perhaps no royal took sleeping, or rather refusing to wake, as far as Charles VI of France, known to some as Charles the Mad. Charles became king in 1380, a teenager crowned in the middle of the 100 Years' War. Unfortunately, the pressures of rule collided with a nervous system apparently designed for collapse. By his early 20s, Charles began experiencing episodes where he refused to recognize his wife, children, or government. Sometimes he believed he was made entirely of glass and would lie motionless for days, terrified of shattering. His attendants had to reinforce his bed with extra cushions so he wouldn't injure himself rolling over. At times, he slept for extraordinary stretches, waking only to eat spoonfuls of broth before slipping back into unconsciousness. Entire factions rose and fell in France, while Charles was unaware of his surroundings. In court records, his absences were delicately referred to as periods of reflection, which of course they weren't. The irony of all this is that monarchs were imagined as divine, untouchable beings, chosen by God, ordained to lead. And yet behind the embroidered curtains their bodies were frail, their minds delicate, and their habits absurdly impractical. Entire dynasties depended on kings who couldn't get out of bed without assistance. But the deeper you go into Europe's royal archives, the more you find this pattern. Fragile men clinging to power from beneath the blankets. And as we drift forward, we'll meet more of them. Some were tragic, some were eccentric, a few were genuinely catastrophic. For now, though, let's stay in Spain a little longer, because after Philip V eventually did get out of bed, his descendants made sure his fragile habits and his fragile genes were passed carefully along. Hey again, let's stay in Spain for a little while longer tonight. Keep the lights low, stay comfortable, and let the hum of history drift in. Because if Philip V seemed fragile, his predecessor, Charles II of Spain, makes him look positively robust. Charles II ruled from 1665 to 1700, and he was, quite frankly, one of the most unfortunate monarchs ever to inherit a throne. Not because he was cruel or incompetent or lazy, though he was certainly all of those at times, but because he was, well, a Habsburg. And if you know anything about the Habsburgs, you already know this doesn't end well. By the time Charles was born, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty had been marrying each other for so long that their family tree looked less like a tree and more like a particularly stubborn vine. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. Generations of royal matchmakers believed that keeping bloodlines pure would preserve power, prestige, and divine favor. It didn't. Charles was the end result of nearly 200 years of relentless dynastic recycling, and the consequences were obvious. His Habsburg jaw was so pronounced that closing his mouth completely was almost impossible. Eating was a challenge. Speaking was worse. And yet official portraits depict him as calm and dignified, because of course they do. Behind the oil paint, though, Charles was a deeply unwell man. Modern geneticists, studying his lineage, suspect he suffered from multiple inherited disorders, mandibular prognathism, endocrine deficiencies, and possible infertility. At just 4 years old, he couldn't walk. By 10, he still struggled to speak in full sentences. At 20, he lost most of his teeth, which combined with jaw deformities made chewing nearly impossible. And yet, at 17, he was declared ready to rule an empire. Charles's reign was less about governing and more about surviving, or attempting to. He spent enormous stretches of time bedridden, plagued by fevers, weakness, and what contemporaries delicately referred to as the king's decline. His physicians, and there were dozens of them, disagreed constantly on treatments. Some suggested bloodletting. Others prescribed elaborate purifying diets involving boiled herbs and warm wine. At one point, they married him off to Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess described by ambassadors as gentle, beautiful, and in possession of a patience bordering on saintly. She would need it. Charles adored her, but unfortunately, their marriage faced challenges. For nearly a decade, they tried, under immense pressure, to produce a child. Court physicians hovered constantly, offering intrusive advice and strange remedies. One recommended that Charles drink stallion broth daily. Another suggested he bathe in goat's milk to invigorate the humors. Marie-Louise eventually fell into deep depression, worn down by repeated public humiliation, and died at just 26. Officially from appendicitis, though whispers at court blamed stress, exhaustion, and a lifetime spent trying to live with a man whose body and mind were failing him in equal measure. Charles remarried quickly, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from yet another tightly inbred line. She arrived in Madrid determined, energetic, and thoroughly unimpressed by her husband's health, or lack thereof. Her solution to his problems was simple: more relics, more blessings, and considerably more exorcisms. Because, yes, by this point, many believed Charles's inability to produce an heir wasn't medical, but supernatural. Rumors spread that he'd been cursed at birth. Priests were summoned, and at one point, an entire convent spent weeks fasting and praying exclusively for Charles's fertility. It didn't work. By the end of his life, Charles spent most of his days lying in bed, barely conscious, surrounded by physicians and priests arguing over whether to bleed him, bless him, or both simultaneously. His court diaries become almost painfully repetitive. His Majesty has eaten nothing today. His Majesty is weaker today. His Majesty slept most of the day. When Charles finally died in 1700, aged just 38, his body was described in shocking detail by the attending physician. According to the autopsy report, his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his intestines were rotting, and his testicles were withered and black as raisins. It's not a restful image, but it speaks volumes about the fragility of his body, and, symbolically, of his dynasty. Charles's death without an heir triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a European conflict so sprawling that it drew in nearly every major power of the day. But Charles himself, the last Spanish Habsburg, had spent most of his short reign horizontal, oscillating between illness, exhaustion, and despair. It's a reminder that dynastic power, no matter how vast, could rest on the frailest of foundations, sometimes literally on a single fragile body. And yet, the Spanish weren't alone. Across Europe, dynasties obsessed over preserving pure bloodlines, often at the expense of basic genetic stability. Which brings us to another fascinating figure, Ferdinand I of Austria, a 19th-century emperor whose life, marriage, and curious relationship with naps would become legendary in his own peculiar way. Hey again. Let's drift gently north now, leaving the warm, candlelit corridors of Spain behind and settle into the cold, echoing palaces of Vienna. Because tonight, we're meeting Ferdinand I of Austria, Emperor Habsburg, and man of extremely limited energy. If Charles II of Spain was the fragile conclusion of one Habsburg line, Ferdinand was very much its spiritual cousin, another monarch shaped by centuries of intermarriage, delicate constitutions, and dynastic expectations that his body simply couldn't meet. Ferdinand became Emperor of Austria in 1835. He was 23 years old, and unfortunately for the Austrian Empire, he was also chronically ill, developmentally delayed, and prone to debilitating seizures. The doctors called it dropsy, nervous weakness, and occasionally brain congestion, though modern historians suspect he suffered from hydrocephalus, an abnormal buildup of fluid in the brain, along with epilepsy. To put it gently, Ferdinand was not an emperor built for efficiency. Even as a child, Ferdinand was described in letters as sweet but slow, with fits of fatigue that leave him drowsy for days. The Habsburgs, of course, did not view this as a reason to consider anyone else for the throne. Bloodlines mattered more than competence, and Ferdinand had the right blood. That it was somewhat diluted and poorly distributed was considered secondary. When his father, Emperor Francis I, died, Ferdinand ascended without much ceremony. There was no debate, no contingency plan, no, maybe we should test the cousins. Ferdinand had the crown, and Austria had effectively an emperor who needed frequent naps and constant supervision. Ferdinand's reign quickly became defined by what historians politely call shared governance, which is a delicate way of saying that most decisions were made by other people while Ferdinand sat nearby. In practice, one anecdote from the Austrian court records describes a day when Ferdinand's ministers spent hours explaining a complex economic reform to him. At the end of their presentation, Ferdinand, smiling gently, nodding the whole time, asked only, "And when do we eat?" The policy went ahead regardless. Ferdinand also had a habit of falling asleep during meetings, which caused enormous diplomatic complications. Ambassadors from France, Prussia, and Britain would deliver elaborate speeches about trade or alliances, only to realize, several minutes in, that the emperor was softly snoring in his chair.